A few years back, I'm in the car driving home, going over what just happened, because that's what us self aware peeps do, hey. I can trace back to exactly when it happened, why it all fell apart, and I remember beating myself up about how it all played out. Because only then in that moment could I put it all together. I can pinpoint when I felt the sensations in my body and when I said what I said instead of what I meant. Welcome to Human Evolution, the podcast where growth gets real, patterns get exposed, and things start to look a little different. I'm Jodie Tala, integrative neuroregulation coach and the founder of MindDrop. This is where we have the conversations that don't always get said out loud, unpacking emotional regulation, neuroscience, and the patterns shaping how you think, feel, and show up in the world, and what it really takes to change. For the self-aware, heart-led humans and high performers who are done running on autopilot and ready to live life on purpose. Let's go. So I want to start today's episode somewhere that might feel a little obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning because I hear these terms interchanged all the time: awareness and insight. People use them often as if they mean the same thing, but they don't. Awareness is present moment. Noticing what's happening right now, the sensations in your body, like the tightness in your chest, the thought running through your head on repeat, the feeling that energy just shifted in a room. Awareness is that what, as it's actually happening. Insight, however, is the why. It's almost always retrospective. It arrives after the fact. It's in the car when you're driving home. It's writing in your journal before bed, in the therapy room, going back over what happened last Tuesday. When it clicks, something real shifts. You connect the dots and you see things differently. It's that moment of, that's what that is. So that's the insight. And here's the thing about both of them. They're both cognitive processes. They work in language, which means neither one can directly reach the layer where that pesky pattern that's been repeating actually lives. Now, the belief that understanding something heals it goes back well over 100 years, back to the days of Freud. His model was when you repress something, it becomes a symptom. Bring that symptom into conscious awareness, understand it, and then the symptom resolves. It was considered the talking cure, understanding as the mechanism of change. And that idea kind of got baked into a lot of how people think about therapy and personal development and have contributed towards those things over the years. Now, thankfully, that perspective is changing. That's a good thing. And look, it sort of also makes sense as a belief because insight does actually do something real and it's important. It just does it at one of the layers. And often the things that we're working on, the things that are deeply holding us back from the life that we want to live, are deeper layers than that surface layer that we're talking about, our CEO layer. So, and this is why I hear what I hear from my clients time and time again. People who have done years of this work, they understand themselves deeply. They've traced patterns back further than most people would ever go. And what they say is this: hey, Jodes, now I know why I feel the way I feel. I get it, but I still feel it and nothing's actually changed. And they're not wrong. That insight is real. The work that they're doing is real. And the pattern, however, is still running like it's Groundhog Day. So here's what's actually happening. We're going to get a little sciencey here, but it's super interesting. So hang in there with me. Our brains have different areas relating to our memory. Once you understand them, and we're going to only go into two of them, a lot of it starts to make a lot more sense. The first is explicit memory. So explicit memory is when something happens, the hippocampus files it and it indexes it for later access. And over time, that memory transfers into the neocortex, which is where your prefrontal cortex lives, for long-term storage. That's our CEO, if you remember from previous episodes. And the amygdala, which is our guard dog, is in there as well. And it's attaching the emotional weight to what's being stored, which is why emotionally charged memories are so hard to forget, especially the negative ones. The amygdala's involvement makes them stickier, more vivid, and definitely more likely to be retained and recalled. So when you recall that memory, it's coming from the neocortex. And that's a part of our brain which has the prefrontal cortex in it, which is where our CEO lives, right? And it's actively holding and working with it consciously. So that's our explicit memory. Then we have implicit memory. This one's a little bit different because it includes emotional conditioning. It includes the automatic threat responses, which is the amygdala, the guard dog's territory. But there's also procedural stuff. And this is the things the body just does without you deciding to. Have you ever driven home only to get there realizing you can't remember making a single turn? Or what about automatically tensing up in your body before having a hard conversation? You just know it's not going to be pleasant. Or when you feel unsafe somewhere. So those live in the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the body itself. And none of that is conscious. So none of that is running in the CEO. It's not running through our language center directly. And it wasn't stored that way to begin with. Here's what that kind of means in a practical term. These types of patterns and memories aren't just thoughts you haven't examined closely enough. They're physiological. They're encoded in your nervous system as physical responses. So typically you can't think your way out of a physiological response because thinking and these automatic patterns, which is like the apps, if you remember, are operated in completely different systems. Your thinking is with your CEO and the app is underneath that. It's unconscious more often than not. Van der Kolk's neuroimaging research showed that when those stored patterns fire, and that's when the apps run, the Broca's area in the brain, which is our language center, often goes offline. The experience that created the pattern wasn't processed through language when it was actually laid down and encoded to begin with. So trying to reach it through language, through insight, through understanding and talking it through in general, you're working in a completely different system to where it actually is living. It's not to say it won't impact it to some degree, but often it won't clear it fully. The insight lands at that conscious layer with the CEO, right? The pattern is actually running below it in the app. And this is why, and I want to be clear, this is not a rock throwing exercise here. A lot of traditional therapy, though, doesn't create the lasting change people are looking for. There are incredible therapists doing body-based, trauma-informed work who are working within the right levels or the right layers. And I never want to discount having the space to genuinely feel heard and sometimes voicing something in safety for the very first time. That's really, really important and it matters. However, traditional talk therapy is typically cognitive, so that's your CEO's territory, and language-based by design. It works at the conscious layer. And what can happen, especially in client-led therapy where the therapist follows what the client brings in, is the same story gets visited again and again. Same emotional charge is still sitting within it. And the neuroscience is pretty clear on this. Every time a neural pathway fires, including when the story gets retold with full emotional activation, you're strengthening it. Remember, what fires together wires together. Neurons connect, the myelin wraps around the axon tighter, the signal gets faster and becomes more automatic. Repetition plus emotional charge is exactly how these pathways, which is the highway, if you remember from previous episodes, got built in the first place. These are how these paradigms form and how identity becomes cemented. That's the operating system getting another level and another layer of confirmation, another update that says, this is who you are, this is how things work. Maybe you can relate. You can leave a session feeling completely understood and have actually reinforced the very pathway you were trying to shift. And it's not because what you're doing isn't real or isn't good, but it's because typically the tool was working at the wrong layer. Ever heard of analysis paralysis? This is where the analysis of the event or the memory itself becomes the pattern. And this can happen in therapy also. So the more that you examine it, the more that you think about it, the more in itself that feels like forward motion, like something's happening, and can feel quite cathartic at times. But thinking about it without ever working at that level that it lives in isn't actually progress. It's running the same loop dressed up as the work. Deep analysis without the body involved can actually keep you more frozen than if you'd never examined it at all. So if insight was enough, you'd already be there. Therapy, we wouldn't be in it for years on end. So we need to clear the emotional charge that's keeping that up running. Think of it as like deleting the app or even upgrading it. The guard dog needs to be retrained with new evidence, not told through reasoning that the threat isn't real, but shown through direct, repeated experience until it actually knows it. And the operating system, which is your identity layer, was built through experience. It only ever updates through experience and repetition. And that's a completely different process to having insight. So here's what I want you to take from this. The gap between knowing and changing is about capacity and working with the right layers, often simultaneously. My bet is that if you haven't experienced the change that you're seeking, you've been working in the language layer. That's the insight, awareness, understanding, and talking it through. It's important. We need those skills. Please understand me. But the pattern has been living somewhere the language center just doesn't reach, that language layer doesn't go to. They live in the body, in automatic responses that fire before conscious thought even has a chance to chime in. They're in your nervous system running the same program long after the conditions that created it have passed. You've heard me talk about this. And conditions, might I add, that often weren't even yours to begin with. And that is not something you can insight your way out of through talk therapy. And I want to name something here because I know what some of you might be thinking. Insight does work sometimes, and I've seen it. Some people have a moment of understanding and something clicks and shifts and it creates change. But there is something specific that's running underneath what happens in that process, and we're going to get into that in another episode in the future because it's really fascinating and it does change how you think about your own patterns. But for those patterns that are wired in deep, which is often the ones that we're wanting to change, or those patterns that are super emotionally charged, which is often what happens through trauma, or that have been running like way longer before you had any say in it. So often the ones that were programmed into us when we're in our formative years between 0 to 7. You'll likely find the growth and change you're seeking via a different pathway in, or a multi-pathway connection. It's a nuanced conversation, and there are many moving parts, but I hope this kind of answers why insight alone doesn't always create the change that you're looking for. Coming up in our next episode, we're talking about the high functioning and dysregulated profile, because there's a very specific experience that belongs to people who hold it together on the outside, who show up and perform and deliver, while something very different is actually running underneath. If you know what it's like to look completely capable from the outside whilst quietly running on empty and silently screaming at the same time, then next week is for you. See you there. Hey, my beautiful friend. Thanks for hanging out and listening to today's episode. If you want to keep the momentum going, head over to the vault at minddrophq.com/podcast. It's where all the tools, resources, and gold from the show are kept, so your growth doesn't stop when the episode ends. If this episode sparks something in you, share it with a friend or someone who needs to hear this. The more people having these conversations, the bigger the ripple we create. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. It really means the world. Until next time, keep being your gorgeous, unstoppable self.